I think what confuses people about election laws, what they aim to do, is that you have a structure for government. That's essentially what the U.S. Constitution is. There's parts of it that appertain to other aspects of social existence. And the structure itself is going to affect what life is going to be like in society. But society and the government are two different things, because all government at all levels are limited. State and local are limited, as well as the federal government. They are designed to function within what the Federalist Papers referred to as orbits. So they are designed to function and address peculiar things within their orbit, as they say. For instance, there is no provision in the Constitution that says we're going to have one political party, the Democratic Republican Party, and we're going to divide it into two factions, the Democrats and the Republicans. But that's essentially what we have. Now, you could argue that this is something that occurs because of the way that the Constitution sets up a structure. I don't believe that. I think it's far more complicated than that, and I don't think it's actually important to try to analyze it and find what the origin of these things are, because it's a process of evolution. In other words, there's no pristine state in United States policy. Like I've said before, there's no pristine state regarding debt. The United States has always had debt problems. They've always had factional problems. The factions that existed at the time of ratification were the anti-federalists and the federalists. And it was practically the same as it is now, a 50-50 split. The U.S. Constitution was just barely ratified. So all of these things that these pieces of legislation regarding elections are designed to address don't really have anything to do with what the Constitution is, because there's a separate way in which the Constitution is altered. The Constitution, all it really does is it sets up a means whereby people are elected to office. From my point of view, the things that I want, or the things that I expect from government, which are doable, is not based on who exactly is occupying these offices. As long as they're reasonable people and they're not like somebody that's out to create a theocracy or these things like the War Powers Resolution and things like that, which I don't agree with. It really doesn't matter who these people are, as long as they understand what the laws actually are and what Republican government is. It's all that really matters. And really, reading some of these decisions, that's what the problem is because you can't create legislation that's going to fit into the structure when you try to dictate certain outcomes. And I think that, unfortunately, that's what these pieces of legislation do. You try to also, both factions, the Democrats and the Republicans, I think what a lot of it is that one side sets the legislation up so that it will be reviewed. We want the Supreme Court to review this. We want them to make the decisions that we are supposed to make as a legislature, but quite frankly don't have the guts to make. We want the court to do it for us, like these budget decisions. I used to think to myself, how long is it going to be before the federal government starts doing budgets the way that New York State does? They have a little committee. New York State has the governor and the head guy from each legislative chamber, and they do the budget because in the legislature, the assembly, as they say, they can't ever decide on how to do the budget. So, like I said, these are extemporaneous statements that I make, and seldom do I really know where they're going. But this does disturb me a great deal. I think that the Occupy Wall Street movement is a fabulous thing. It's restored my confidence in humanity. But I think that there's groups like this corporate personhood thing. There's these groups that try to exploit the movement for their own purposes. And I'm just as much guilty of that as these other people are, except I have no juice. And I think that is one of the things that these people that look at this legislation expect. They have expectations that somehow Congress, whom are members of these factions, are somehow going to create something that's going to allow like a person like me, for instance, if I want to run for office, is going to allow me a greater opportunity to take a seat away from one of these factions. In fact, the 71 legislation, if you look at it, incorporates all of the things that seem to me to be that which many members of the Occupy Wall Street are opposed to, as well as the Democratic Party. So how do you get rid of things if you concede to them in something that you say, okay, this is the law? Whether you send it to the court for them to decide whether it actually shall be the law or not. To me, that's not the way to proceed. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, which I addressed in part 2. Berger, another guy that I don't particularly like, he brought up some good points in his dissent. I think he was one of. No, I guess he wasn't a dissenter. He concurred and dissented in part. I don't know. But he mentioned something about he felt that the newspapers themselves, corporations that are chartered for a purpose that appertains to the First Amendment, could have a greater detrimental effect than corporations such as this First National Bank of Boston that got embroiled in some sort of initiative regarding income taxes, which really all of the members of the court conceded has absolutely nothing to do with the purposes for which they were chartered. Um, I'm kind of getting lost here what I was talking about. But, well, I used to be a member of the Democratic Party. I had my little DNC card and all of that. And the Democratic Party at one time, particularly in the early 80s, a lot of the members had this thing about $100 contributions. They thought, you know, if everybody made $100 contributions, that's a good, decent contribution, you know. I used to make rather generous contributions to the Democratic Party, and in fact, when I wanted to write an editorial for the local paper here, the Press and Sun Bulletin, it was almost at will. If I submitted an editorial, it was almost automatic that they would publish it. It was seldom reviewed. It was just, you know, like that. But when I quit the Democratic Party in 1986, that privilege, private privilege, ended. It was just completely ended. You know, I'd submit an editorial, forget about it. It's not going to be printed. So how do you legislate something like that? You can't force a newspaper to execute some First Amendment aspect as you see it or as Congress sees it. They're going to print what they want to print. Primarily, they're going to print what sells newspapers or what sells advertising. Once they have a reasonable circulation, or if it's like this area, there's only one newspaper, they pretty much have a monopoly on advertising. If people are going to advertise and they're going to use the newspaper, there's only one newspaper. You know, so these decisions that you have like this are made in the private sector. And there's really not a lot that you could do about it. So one of the problems in this legislation that was reviewed in Buckley versus Vallejo was that Congress accepted all of that. And I do not accept that. I see that as the problem. I'm never going to be able to afford myself to buy even a quarter-page ad in any newspaper for anything. It's just, to me, it's just some expense that would never be made. A business would never do this unless it was going to produce some sort of revenue for them. So the whole idea of using what is essentially a commercial instrument, a newspaper, for political purposes, you're going to have conflicts of issues, because these things evolved in a circumstance regarding finance and commerce. They did not evolve in a situation regarding what people would like the First Amendment to be. So those are the sorts of things that have to be addressed, because once you concede or incorporate these things into a piece of legislation and then somehow think that you're going to make it better, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. Whether the court accepts this or the court doesn't accept it, you're still going to have the same conflicts and the same issues. So it's really this whole idea is just, at best, fine-tuning the status quo.